The knife was already at her throat when Alara Voss opened her eyes. She did not scream. She did not move. She counted the weight of the hand pressing down on her shoulder, the angle of the wrist holding the blade, the small tremor in the fingers of a man who had never done this before. Then she moved so fast the guard outside her door heard nothing but a single thud, like a book falling off a shelf. By the time anyone came running, the attacker was face down on the stone floor, his own knife resting flat against the back of his neck, and Alara was sitting on the edge of her bed, tying her hair back as if she had simply woken up early. King Ravik Thorn arrived moments later, his chest bare, his eyes wild with a fury that had nowhere to land. He looked at the unconscious man on the floor. He looked at his new wife, calm, unshaken, barely out of breath. And for one strange second he did not know which one of them frightened him more. "Take him to the cells," Ravik said, his voice rough with sleep and something else he could not name. "Question him in the morning." The guards obeyed. Alara said nothing. She simply stood, walked to her window, and looked out at the dark forest beyond the palace walls, as though the entire event had already been filed away and forgotten. Ravik stayed in the doorway a moment longer than he needed to. "You are not hurt," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," she answered. "You do understand what almost happened." "I understand exactly what almost happened," she said, without turning around. It simply did not happen the way anyone in this room expected. He did not know what to say to that. He left without saying anything at all. 3 months earlier, Alara had arrived at the Ashen Pack's gates in a plain gray traveling dress, carrying a single trunk and no maid, no guard, no letters of introduction beyond the treaty scroll bearing her father's seal. The wolves lining the courtyard had expected someone soft, someone who would flinch at the size of the palace, the height of the walls, the low growl that seemed to live permanently in the throats of the guards standing watch. Instead, she walked through the gates the way a person walks into a room they already know the layout of, even though she had never set foot there before. She did not look up at the towers the way visitors usually did, eyes wide with fear or wonder. She looked at the exits, at the guard positions, at the places where the stone was worn thin from centuries of boots passing over it. King Ravik Thorn stood at the top of the entrance stairs, arms crossed, waiting to greet the bride his council had arranged as part of a fragile peace between the human territories and the wolf kingdoms. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet, coiled strength that made lesser men want to look away first. He had ruled the Ashen Lands since he was 22, when his father died in a border skirmish that Ravik still refused to talk about. He had buried 2 advisors who tried to have him removed from the throne. He had never lost a fight in his life. He looked down at the small human woman climbing his stairs and felt, for the first time in years, something close to disappointment. "This is her," his beta, a broad-shouldered wolf named Edmund Hale, muttered beside him. "The human bride." "I can see that," Ravik said. "She does not look like much." "No," Ravik agreed, "she does not." Alara stopped 3 steps below him, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough that she was clearly not asking for permission to come closer. She looked up at him with pale gray eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. "King Ravik Thorn," she said. Her voice was calm, even, unbothered by the height of the stairs or the number of armed wolves watching her. "I am Alara Voss. I believe you were told to expect me." "I was told to expect a bride," Ravik said, "not an inspection." Something flickered behind her eyes, gone before he could name it. "I am simply looking at my new home," she said. "Is that forbidden?" "No," he said, "but it is unusual." "I have been called unusual before," she said, and climbed the rest of the stairs without waiting for his hand. That night at the welcoming feast, the whispers began. She ate little, she spoke less. She sat at the high table with her spine straight and her hands folded, watching the room the way a person watches weather they do not entirely trust. The pack's nobles, dressed in furs and silver, traded glances over their wine cups. A human bride, thin and quiet, brought in to seal a treaty no one particularly wanted. She would not last the winter, they said. She would break the first time a wolf raised its voice at her. Ravik heard the whispers too, and did not correct them. He had married her because his council demanded it, because peace with the human territories mattered more than his own preferences, because refusing would have meant war along a border his people were tired of defending. He had not married her because he believed in her. He watched her sit silently through her own wedding feast and decided, privately, that she would need protecting, that she was, in the end, exactly what she appeared to be, fragile, ornamental, a treaty wrapped in human skin. He could not have been more wrong, though it would take him a long time to understand that. In the weeks that followed, the palace tested her in small, deniable ways. Her meals arrived cold, or not at all. Her requests to the household staff were met with polite confusion, as though no one quite understood what she was asking. The seamstress assigned to her wardrobe took 2 weeks to deliver a single gown, and when it arrived, the stitching was deliberately poor, the hem uneven, clearly meant to embarrass her at the next gathering. Alara said nothing to Ravik about any of it. She did not complain. She did not demand better treatment or threaten to write home to her father. She simply adjusted. She learned which kitchen staff would help her if asked quietly, away from watching eyes. She fixed the gown's hem herself, with small, even stitches that no one in the sewing hall could explain, and wore it to dinner without comment, daring anyone to say a word. Ravik noticed none of this. He was a king with a kingdom to run, borders to defend, a rival monarch across the eastern hills who had never stopped testing the edges of the treaty that kept their two nations from open war. His new wife was, to him, a small and quiet problem he had already solved by ignoring it. What he did not know was where she went every morning before the sun rose. There was a courtyard on the northern side of the palace, walled in on 3 sides, forgotten by nearly everyone since the old training master had died years earlier. The stone was cracked. Weeds grew between the flagstones. No guard bothered to patrol it, because no one used it, because there was nothing there worth guarding. Alara went there every morning at an hour, when even the earliest kitchen staff were still asleep. She brought no weapons from the palace armory, because taking one would have meant someone noticed it missing. Instead, she used what she found: a broken training pole, a length of old rope, her own hands and feet, and the years of training that had shaped them long before she ever saw the Ashen Palace gates. She moved through forms that had no names anyone in this kingdom would recognize, forms taught to her not in a training yard with an audience, but in silence, out of necessity, by people who no longer had the luxury of teaching gently. She did not train like someone preparing for a duel. She trained like someone who had already been in more fights than she could count, and intended to survive the next one too. By the time the sun came up, she was back in her rooms, hair damp, breathing even, dressed and composed before her first servant knocked to ask if she required breakfast. No one saw her leave. No one saw her return. It was, she had learned long ago, far safer to be underestimated than admired. The first real test of the peace came on a gray afternoon in early autumn, when a messenger arrived from the Blackfang pack, announcing that King Draven Kale would be visiting the Ashen Court within the week, under a formal banner of diplomacy. Ravik's council erupted into arguments the moment the messenger left the hall. Draven Kale was no ally. His pack sat along the eastern border, and for 2 generations the Blackfang and Ashen Kings had traded insults, skirmishes, and half-broken treaties, each one testing how far the other could be pushed before real war returned. Draven was ambitious, clever, and utterly without patience for weakness in anyone, least of all in a rival he considered beneath him. "He wants to see the human bride," Edmund said flatly, standing at the head of the council table. "He has heard the rumors. A quiet, ordinary woman married into the Ashen Throne to seal a human treaty. He wants to see for himself whether the stories are true." "Let him look," Ravik said. "There is nothing to see." He meant it as reassurance. It came out sounding like something else entirely, something closer to resignation, and across the room, unnoticed by anyone but the servant clearing empty cups from a side table, Alara heard every word of it through the half-open door. She did not flinch. She had long since stopped expecting anyone in this palace to see her clearly. What mattered was not what Ravik believed about her. What mattered was what she knew about herself, a knowledge built slowly, painfully, over years he knew nothing about, in places he had never been forced to survive. That evening, she asked for her supper to be brought to her rooms instead of the great hall, and no one questioned it. She sat by the window as the last light faded over the northern courtyard, turning a small worn blade over in her hands, the same blade she had carried since she was 16 years old, hidden now beneath the floorboard beside her bed where no palace servant would ever think to look. She thought about her father's letters, filled with careful diplomatic language about peace and duty and the good of 2 nations. She thought about the treaty that had brought her here, a piece of parchment that meant nothing to the wolves who still called her a liability behind closed doors. And she thought, without any particular anger, about the rival king who was already on his way, certain he would find exactly what everyone else expected to find. She closed her hand around the blade's worn hilt. Let him come, she thought. Let them all come, and see what they think they already know. Outside her window, the last light disappeared behind the tree line, and the palace settled into the kind of quiet that precedes something about to change. Somewhere beyond the eastern hills, a rival king was already moving toward the Ashen Court, carrying with him an insult he had not yet spoken, and a mistake he did not yet know he was about to make. Ilara set the blade back beneath the floorboard, smoothed the wood into place, and went to sleep with the same calm, unreadable expression she wore for everyone in this palace, including, most of the time, the man she had married. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the beginning of everything no one in that court had thought to prepare for. The Blackfang party arrived at midday, banners snapping in a wind that smelled of rain, and the entire Ashen court turned out to watch them come. Draven Kale rode at the front, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own importance. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, tossed the reins to a waiting groom without looking at him, and walked up the palace stairs as though he already owned them. Ravik met him at the top, arms folded, jaw tight. The two kings had known each other for years, and neither bothered pretending otherwise. "Ravik," Draven said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "You look tired. Marriage does not seem to agree with you." "Draven," Ravik answered. "You look exactly the same. I assume ambition keeps a man well preserved." Draven laughed, a short, sharp sound, and clapped Ravik on the shoulder as if they were old friends rather than rivals separated by 2 generations of border disputes. "I have come to see this treaty of yours honored properly. A formal visit, nothing more. Peaceful intentions, as agreed." "Your version of peaceful has cost me 3 border posts in the last decade," Ravik said. "Border posts change hands," Draven said easily. "That is simply the nature of borders. Where is she, by the way?" "Your human bride. I confess I am curious to meet the woman worth an entire treaty." Ravik's jaw tightened further, but he said nothing, only turned and led the way inside, Draven falling into step beside him with the unhurried stride of a man who had never once needed to rush toward anything. Ilara met them in the receiving hall, dressed simply, her hair pulled back, her expression composed into something perfectly neutral. She had heard everything about Draven Kale that the servants whispered in the kitchens, and she had drawn her own conclusions long before ever seeing his face. Men who announced their own importance this loudly were usually compensating for something they feared others might notice if they stopped talking. Draven looked her over the way a merchant looks over livestock at market, slow and assessing, clearly unimpressed by what he found. "So this is her," he said, to Ravik rather than to Ilara herself, as though she were a piece of furniture that happened to be standing nearby. "Smaller than I expected. Your treaty seems a poor trade for 3 border posts, old friend." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gathered nobles. Ravik's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he said nothing, and that silence, more than anything Draven had said, was the thing Ilara noticed most. "I am standing directly in front of you," she said, her voice calm, carrying easily across the hall. "You are welcome to address me instead of the furniture, should you wish to continue this conversation." The laughter stopped. Draven's eyebrows rose, more amused than offended. "She speaks," he said. "How refreshing. Tell me, little human bride, do you understand what you have married into? This is a kingdom of wolves, real power, real teeth. What exactly do you bring to this arrangement besides your father's ink on a scroll?" "Patience," Ilara said, "which is more than I can say for you, given how fast you have run out of manners." A few of the younger nobles smothered laughter behind their hands. Draven's smile thinned at the edges, but he recovered fast, waving a dismissive hand as though her words were beneath his notice. "Careful," he said, to Ravik now, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "A tongue like that will get her into trouble one day, in a kingdom that does not tolerate weakness." "She is not weak," Ravik said, the words coming out before he had fully decided to say them. Draven laughed again, louder this time. "No? Then perhaps you should let her speak for herself more often, instead of standing there looking like you are not entirely certain what you brought home." The insult landed cleanly, and Ravik knew it, because it was true. He did not know what he had brought home. He had spent 3 months assuming he understood exactly what kind of woman his bride was, and every day she proved him wrong in small, quiet ways he had chosen not to examine too closely. The formal banquet that evening was worse. Draven, emboldened by wine and the audience of 2 full courts, grew louder as the night wore on, his jokes edging from playful to cruel, each one aimed with practiced precision at the fault line he had already found. He called Ilara a pet. He called her a liability dressed up as diplomacy. He suggested, to general laughter, that the Ashen Throne had grown so desperate for peace that it would marry a king to anyone willing to sign a scroll. Ravik sat through all of it with his jaw locked and his hands flat on the table, saying nothing in her defense, telling himself that silence was strategy, that provoking Draven further would only escalate tensions the treaty was meant to ease. He told himself this even as something cold settled in his chest, because deep down he knew the truth was simpler and far less flattering. He had not defended her because, in some quiet corner of his mind he did not want to admit to, he agreed with what Draven was saying. She was small. She was quiet. She had shown him nothing yet to prove otherwise, and a king could not afford to gamble his throne's dignity on a woman he barely knew. Elara said little through the meal, eating slowly, watching everything, absorbing every insult without giving Draven the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But beneath the table, where no one could see, her hand rested on her knee, fingers pressed flat against the fabric of her gown, steady and still, the same stillness she brought to every fight she had ever survived. Let him talk, she thought. Words cost nothing. It was actions that mattered, and Draven Kale had not yet seen a single one of hers. Later that night, long after the banquet hall had emptied, and the last of the wine had been cleared away, Ravik found himself standing outside her door, his hand raised to knock, uncertain what he meant to say if she answered. He had spent the walk from the hall rehearsing something that might sound like an apology without actually being one, some careful, kingly phrase that would smooth over the evening without admitting he had done anything wrong. He knocked. She answered almost immediately, still dressed, as though she had not intended to sleep yet at all. "You did not defend me tonight," she said, before he could speak first. "I did not think it wise to escalate the tension," he said. "You mean you did not think I was worth the risk," she said, and it was not a question, and it was not spoken with anger either, only a flat, clear-eyed honesty that unsettled him more than shouting would have. "That is not," he started, and stopped, because he was not certain how to finish the sentence honestly. "It is fine," she said. "You do not owe me your good opinion. But you should know that Draven Kale will keep pushing until someone shows him a wall he cannot push through. I would advise you to think carefully about who that wall will be." She closed the door before he could answer, and Ravik stood alone in the corridor for a long moment, turning her words over, aware that something in them had lodged itself under his skin and would not easily come loose. He did not yet understand what she meant. He would, in time, understand it completely. But that night, he walked back to his own chambers with the uncomfortable sense that he had misjudged something important, without yet being able to name what it was. 2 days after the banquet, Draven Kale announced he would be staying an extra week to observe the Ashen Court's harvest ceremonies, a courtesy Ravik could not politely refuse without appearing to fear his rival's presence. The palace settled into a tense, watchful rhythm, every conversation held a little too carefully, every smile a little too practiced. Elara used the extra days to learn more about the Blackfang delegation than anyone realized she was learning. She spoke quietly with the kitchen staff who served Draven's men, asking simple, harmless questions about their travels, their homeland, their king. She watched how Draven's own guards positioned themselves in a room, how fast they reacted to sudden movement, how loyal they truly were beneath the polished performance of unity they presented in public. What she found unsettled her more than Draven's insults ever could. His guards did not love him. They feared him, the particular fear of men who had seen what happened to those who failed their king. And fear, Elara knew from long experience, made for unpredictable allies in a fight. A man who ruled through fear alone rarely inspired anyone to protect him past the point where doing so cost them something. On the 4th morning, while the palace was still half asleep, Elara returned from her private courtyard earlier than usual, and nearly collided with Edmund Hale in the corridor outside the kitchens. He looked at her closely, at the faint sheen of sweat still on her skin despite the early hour, at the ease in her stance that did not match the delicate, breakable image the court had built around her. "You are up early," he said carefully. "I do not sleep well in unfamiliar places," she answered, which was not quite a lie and not quite the truth either. Edmund studied her a moment longer than politeness required. He was not a fool, whatever else the court thought of him, and something about the set of her shoulders, the calluses beginning to show along her palms, did not fit the story everyone had agreed to believe about her. "May I ask you something, my lady?" he said. "You may ask," she said. "I make no promises about an answer." "Where did you learn to move like that?" he asked. "The night of the attack, in your chambers. I saw the man you left on the floor. He was one of our own trained guards, and you left him without a mark that would slow a healer down. That is not luck. That is training. Real training, the kind we do not teach women in human settlements, as far as I have ever heard." Elara held his gaze for a long moment, weighing how much truth this particular wolf had earned. "Where I come from," she said finally, "peace was never something anyone could afford to take for granted. My father's lands sat along a border far less forgiving than this one. I learned to defend myself because the alternative was not survivable. That is all I am willing to say on the matter, and I would ask that you keep it between us." Edmund inclined his head slowly. "The king should know this. The king has already decided what kind of woman I am. Elara said, without bitterness, simply stating a fact. I see no reason to correct him before it becomes necessary. Some lessons are better learned through demonstration than explanation. She continued down the corridor before Edmund could press further, leaving him standing there with the uneasy sense that he had just glimpsed the edge of something far larger than the quiet, unremarkable bride the court believed it understood. That evening, the tension finally broke. At a smaller informal gathering in the Eastern Gardens, meant to ease the stiffness of the earlier banquet, Draven Kale had clearly had enough wine to abandon whatever restraint he had shown before. He cornered Elara near a stone fountain, away from the largest cluster of guests. Ravik occupied several paces away in conversation with two of his own advisors. You have quite a reputation building already, Draven said, swirling his cup lazily. The quiet human bride who put a trained wolf guard on the floor without breaking a sweat. Tell me, was that skill, or simple good fortune? Does it matter which, so long as the outcome was the same? Elara asked. It matters a great deal, Draven said, stepping closer, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath. Because if it was skill, then perhaps you are not the harmless little treaty ornament everyone assumes you to be. And if that is true, I find myself wondering what else about you has been carefully hidden from this court. You are welcome to keep wondering, Elara said, not moving back, not giving him the satisfaction of retreat. I owe you no explanations, King Draven. I am not your subject, and I am not your concern. Everything within these walls is my concern, while I am a guest here, Draven said, his smile sharpening into something colder. Especially anything that might weaken my old friend Ravik's grip on his own throne. A king, married to a liability, is a king vulnerable to challenge. Perhaps that is worth exploring further, before I return home. Careful, Elara said quietly. You are standing very close to a line you have not yet earned the right to cross. Draven laughed, low and mocking. A line, drawn by you. I have led armies larger than this entire palace, little human bride. I do not fear lines drawn by someone who has never held a blade in true combat. You assume a great deal about what I have and have not done, Elara said, and something in her voice had shifted, quiet steel replacing quiet patience, though her expression remained as calm as ever. Before Draven could respond, Ravik appeared at her side, drawn by some instinct he could not name, his presence enough to make Draven step back with exaggerated ease, as though he had simply been engaged in friendly conversation all along. Ravik, Draven said smoothly, your bride and I were simply discussing the nature of courage, a fascinating subject. Is that so? Ravik said, his eyes moving between the two of them, reading tension he could not fully interpret. Indeed, Draven said, though I suspect we shall have to continue the discussion another time. It grows late, and I find I have had quite enough wine for one evening. He walked away without another word, leaving Ravik and Elara standing alone by the fountain in a silence that stretched longer than either of them found comfortable. What was that about? Ravik asked finally. Nothing you need concern yourself with, Elara said. He is my guest, in my palace, speaking to my wife, Ravik said. I believe that concerns me a great deal. Then perhaps you should have concerned yourself 3 nights ago when he called me a pet in front of your entire court, Elara said, and though her voice remained calm, the words landed with more force than any raised voice could have managed. You cannot choose which insults are worth your attention after the fact, Ravik. Either my honor matters to this throne, or it does not. Decide which, and act accordingly next time. She left him standing alone by the fountain, the water trickling quietly behind him, and for the second time in a handful of days, Ravik found himself replaying her words long after she had walked away, uncertain why they unsettled him so deeply, only certain that they did. Sleep did not come easily to Ravik that night. He lay awake long after the palace had gone quiet, staring at the ceiling of his chambers, turning Elara's words over and over until they wore grooves into his thoughts. Either my honor matters to this throne, or it does not. He had built his entire rule on the principle that a king who did not defend what belonged to him did not deserve to keep it, and yet here he was, failing to apply that same principle to his own wife. He rose before dawn, restless, and found himself walking the palace corridors without any real destination in mind, until his feet carried him, almost without his permission, toward the northern side of the grounds, an area he rarely visited, home to little more than an old, forgotten training courtyard that had fallen out of use since before his father's death. He heard the sound before he saw anything, a rhythmic, controlled movement, breath timed with motion, the soft scrape of bare feet against worn stone. He stopped at the edge of the courtyard entrance, hidden by the shadow of the wall, and watched. Elara moved through the gray pre-dawn light like something he did not have a name for, Not the careful, hesitant steps of someone unused to physical exertion, but something fluid and precise, each motion connected to the next in a chain that told him, more clearly than any explanation could have, that this was not a woman discovering her own strength for the first time. This was a woman returning to something she had known for years, something worn smooth by repetition, sharpened by necessity. She struck an old wooden training post with the flat of her palm, a sound like a door slamming shut, then spun low, sweeping an invisible opponent's legs, then rose again into stillness, breathing even, controlled, unreadable even now, even alone, even when she believed no one was watching. Ravik stood frozen at the courtyard entrance for a long time, watching his wife train in a manner that had nothing ornamental about it, nothing performed for an audience. This was survival, distilled into muscle memory. This was a woman who had been shaped by something far harder than a comfortable human upbringing behind safe walls. He must have made some small sound, because she stopped abruptly, turning toward the shadows with an alertness that told him she had likely known he was there long before he realized he had been seen. "How long have you been standing there?" she said, not accusing, simply asking. "Long enough," he admitted. She said nothing, waiting, giving him the space to either walk away or ask the question clearly written across his face. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he said finally. Alara was quiet for a moment, weighing, as she always did, how much of herself this particular conversation was worth revealing. "My father's land sat along the western border," she said at last. "Not the peaceful, protected borders you imagine when you think of human territories. Raiders came through twice a year, sometimes more. My mother did not survive one of those raids. I was 7 years old when I decided I would not share her fate." She said it plainly, without drama, the way a person describes weather from long ago, distant enough now not to bruise on contact, though Ravik suspected the distance had cost her a great deal to build. "I am sorry," he said, because it seemed like the only honest thing to say. "Do not be," she said. "It made me who I am. I do not know if I would trade that version of myself for a softer one, even if I could. The girl who grew up safe would not have survived what I have survived since." "What else have you survived?" he asked quietly. "More than I intend to discuss standing in a training yard at dawn," she said, though something in her tone had softened slightly, an inch of ground given that had not been there before. "It is enough for you to know that the woman your council arranged for you to marry did not arrive here as fragile as everyone assumed. I let the assumption stand because it was useful. People underestimate what they do not fear, and I have found that underestimation, more often than not, works in my favor." Ravik studied her in the gray light, seeing her, truly seeing her, for what felt like the first time since she had climbed his palace stairs 3 months earlier. He thought of every dismissive comment he had made to his council, every private assumption he had allowed himself about her lack of value beyond the treaty she represented, and felt something uncomfortable settle low in his chest, something close to shame. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because Draven Kale grows bolder every day he remains a guest in this palace," she said, "and I suspect you will need to understand what I am capable of before this ends, rather than after. Kings who do not know their own allies tend to make costly mistakes in moments that matter." "Is that what you are?" he asked. "An ally?" Alara considered the question with the same careful weight she gave everything. "I married into this throne because it was arranged for me, the same as it was arranged for you," she said. "But I do not intend to be a piece of parchment gathering dust in your treasury, Ravik. Whatever this marriage becomes, I intend it to be useful, to both of us, rather than ornamental to either." She turned back toward the training post before he could answer, resuming the same fluid, deliberate motions he had watched moments earlier, and Ravik understood, without being told directly, that the conversation had reached its natural end. He left the courtyard quietly, his mind turning over everything he had just learned, aware that the picture he had built of his own wife over 3 months had just been quietly, thoroughly dismantled, replaced by something far more complicated, and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined marrying. He did not yet know how soon he would need every ounce of that danger on his side. The final banquet of Draven's extended visit was meant to close the diplomatic visit on peaceful terms, a formal dinner meant to signal, at least on parchment, that relations between the two kingdoms remained stable. Instead, it became the night everything finally broke apart. Draven arrived already in a mood the servants would later describe as restless, pacing rather than sitting, drinking faster than the hour called for. He had spent the week testing every wall in the Ashen Court, and finding none of them gave way the way he expected, and a man like Draven Kale did not handle failure gracefully. The insult, when it came, was not aimed carelessly. It was aimed with precision, in front of the full gathered court. timed for maximum damage. I have been thinking, Draven announced, raising his cup as though proposing a toast, about the nature of strength. A king's true strength, I have always believed, is measured by what he protects, and how well he protects it. A king who cannot even command respect for his own bride, within his own court, hardly seems fit to hold land that others might wish to take from him. The hall fell silent. Ravik's jaw tightened, his hand closing around his own cup hard enough that the wood creaked faintly. I have heard rumors, Draven continued, his voice carrying easily across the hall, that this treaty was arranged out of desperation rather than strength, that the Ashen Throne needed peace with the human territories because it could no longer afford war on two fronts. Tell me, Ravik, is that why you accepted a bride so fast, so quietly, without the ceremony a true alliance deserves, because you needed her more than she needed you? You forget yourself, Draven, Ravik said, his voice low and dangerous. Do I? Draven said, smiling without warmth. Or do I simply see clearly what others in this hall have been too polite to say aloud? A king who cannot protect his own honor, who lets his bride absorb insult after insult without answer, has no true claim to the strength this land requires. Perhaps the Ashen Throne would be better served by a king willing to actually defend what belongs to him. The words landed like a formal challenge, because that is precisely what they were, dressed carefully enough to be denied later if needed, sharp enough that everyone in the hall understood exactly what was being said. Draven was questioning Ravik's fitness to rule, in front of both courts, in a manner that tradition demanded be answered through combat, or accepted as truth. Ravik rose from his seat, fury finally breaking through the careful composure he had maintained for days. I accept your challenge, Draven, he said. Name your terms. Ravik, Alara said, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension, before Draven could respond. Every head in the hall turned toward her. She rose slowly from her own seat, calm, composed, entirely unshaken by the weight of every eye now fixed on her. The insult was aimed at my honor, she said, questioning my worth, my value, my place within this court and this marriage. By the oldest traditions of challenge, the one whose honor is questioned holds the right to answer it personally, or to name a champion of their choosing. I choose to answer it myself. A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the hall. Draven laughed outright, delighted by what he clearly considered an absurd development. You cannot be serious, he said. A human woman, challenging me to combat? This is not diplomacy, this is comedy. I was under the impression kings of your reputation did not fear comedy, Alara said calmly. If you are as confident in your strength as your words suggest, surely a duel against someone you consider beneath serious concern should present you no difficulty at all. Draven's smile faltered slightly, the trap of his own arrogance closing around him in front of two full courts. To refuse now, having mocked her so publicly, would make him appear to fear a woman he had spent an entire week calling weak. To accept felt, to him, like an easy formality, a brief and humiliating lesson he intended to teach her personally. Very well, he said finally, his smile returning, colder now. If the human bride wishes to embarrass herself in front of her own court, who am I to deny her the opportunity? We duel at the new moon, 3 nights from now. Terms to first blood, or surrender, whichever comes first. Agreed, Ilara said. Ilara, Ravik said quietly, stepping toward her, his fury from moments earlier replaced by something closer to alarm. You do not have to do this. I know I do not have to, she said. I am choosing to. The council erupted the moment Draven's delegation withdrew for the evening, voices rising over one another in the great hall, half of them insisting the duel be stopped before it began, that no human bride, however capable she claimed to be, could survive a formal challenge against a wolf king trained for combat since childhood. Edmund alone stood quiet at the edge of the arguing council, watching Alara with the careful attention of someone reassessing everything he thought he understood. Ravik pulled her aside into a private corridor once the worst of the shouting had settled, his expression tight with something between anger and fear. This is madness, he said. Draven has led armies. He has killed men twice your size in single combat. I forbid this. Something shifted behind Alara's calm expression, the first true crack of anger she had allowed him to see since her arrival. You forbid this, she repeated. You, who did not defend my honor a single time in 3 months, now wish to forbid me from defending it myself. Where was this concern for my safety when Draven called me a pet in front of your entire court? Where was your voice then? That is not fair, Ravik said. Fair has very little to do with it, Ilara said. You never once asked me what I survived before I came here, Ravik. You looked at a quiet woman and decided you already knew everything worth knowing. I am done waiting for you to ask the right questions. 3 nights from now, you will finally see something you have refused to look at for 3 months. She turned and walked away before he could answer, leaving him standing alone in the corridor, the echo of the council's argument still audible from the hall beyond. And for the first time since she had arrived at his gates, Ravik felt something close to real fear, not for his throne, not for his kingdom, but for a woman he was only now beginning to understand he might lose, before he had ever truly seen her clearly. News of the duel spread through the Ashen Court within hours, and by the following morning it had reached the border villages, carried by traders and travelers eager to repeat a story too strange not to share. A human bride challenging the Black Fang King in single combat. Most who heard it laughed. Some grew worried on Alara's behalf. Almost no one believed she had any real chance of walking away from the new moon unharmed. The council convened again that afternoon, this time without shouting. The earlier panic settled into a grim, quiet dread. Edmund Hale stood at the head of the table, his expression unusually thoughtful. "We could still stop this," one of the older advisors said. "Declare the challenge invalid. Claim a technicality in the wording. Draven cannot force a duel that the Ashen Throne refuses to honor." "And what message does that send?" Edmund said. "That our king's own bride is too fragile to defend her honor." Exactly as Draven claimed. It would confirm every insult he has spoken this week, in front of both courts. We would lose more by stopping this than by allowing it to proceed. "She will die," the advisor said flatly. "Draven has killed trained wolves in duels before. What chance does a human woman have against him?" "I do not know," Edmund said. "But I watched her disarm an assassin in her own chambers without raising her voice. I have spoken with the kitchen staff who watched her train alone before dawn every day since she arrived. Whatever she is, I do not believe she is what any of us assumed when she first walked through our gates." Across the room, Ravik said nothing, sitting with his hands folded tightly in front of him, his mind replaying the image of Alara moving through the training courtyard in the gray pre-dawn light, precise and controlled and entirely unlike the fragile bride he had spent 3 months dismissing. He found her that evening in the palace library, of all places, reading quietly by candlelight as though the coming duel were nothing more than an ordinary appointment on her calendar. He stood in the doorway a long moment before she looked up. "You are still angry with me," he said. "I am not angry," she said. "I have simply stopped expecting you to see me clearly. It is easier that way, for both of us." "I want to understand," Ravik said, crossing the room to sit across from her. "Truly. Tell me what I need to know before 3 nights from now. Not for my sake. For yours. I want to know what I am watching, when I watch you fight him." Alara studied him for a long moment, weighing, once again, how much truth this conversation had earned. "My father did not simply survive the border raids that took my mother," she said finally. "He rebuilt our household guard from nothing, training every one of us, sons and daughters alike, in the old fighting methods his own grandfather had carried west, generations earlier. I was not simply taught to defend myself. I was raised the way a soldier is raised, from the age of 7, with no exceptions made for my age or my size. By the time I was 15, I had already fought and won duels against grown men twice my weight, because our border allowed for no other option. Survival there was never a matter of choice. It was simply the price of staying alive. And your father agreed to this marriage, knowing what Draven's kingdom is," Ravik said. "My father agreed to this marriage because peace, real peace, was worth more to him than my comfort," Alara said. "He did not send me here unprepared, Ravik. He sent me here as exactly what I am. He simply trusted that whoever received me would eventually be wise enough to notice." Ravik absorbed this in silence, the weight of 3 wasted months settling heavily across his shoulders. He thought of every private conversation with his council in which he had dismissed her value beyond the treaty she represented. He thought of every insult from Draven he had allowed to stand unanswered, certain in some quiet, ashamed corner of his mind that the insults held some truth he did not wish to examine too closely. "I misjudged you," he said finally, "completely. I do not know how to make that right before 3 nights from now, but I want you to know that I see it. I am sorry." Something in Alara's expression eased slightly. Not forgiveness exactly, but something adjacent to it, a small crack in the careful wall she had built around herself since arriving at his gates. "You do not need to make it right before the duel," she said. "You need to trust that I know what I am doing. That is the only thing I require from you right now." "I do trust you," Ravik said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it completely. Alara held his gaze a moment longer, then returned her attention to the book in her lap, though her focus had clearly shifted elsewhere. toward the 3 knights that stood between this quiet library and whatever waited for her beneath the coming new moon. Ravik stayed with her a while longer, saying nothing further, simply present in a way he had not allowed himself to be since her arrival. And for the first time since this arranged, uncertain marriage had begun, something between them had shifted into an understanding neither of them fully had words for yet. Outside, the moon continued its slow, patient march toward darkness, 3 nights from full absence, 3 nights from the duel that would decide far more than either king currently understood. Word of the coming duel had reached every corner of both kingdoms by the second morning, and with it came a steady stream of visitors, messengers, and curious nobles arriving at the Ashen Palace under one excuse or another, all of them hoping for a glimpse of the human bride who had somehow talked her way into a formal challenge against the Blackfang King. Alara ignored all of it. She kept to her usual routine, rising before dawn to train in the northern courtyard, though now, for the first time, she was not entirely alone. Edmund had taken to arriving quietly each morning, standing at the edge of the yard, watching without comment, occasionally offering small, practical corrections that surprised her with their usefulness. He did not treat her with the exaggerated caution some others in the palace now showed her, nor with the dismissive doubt of before. He simply watched a soldier train, the way he might have watched any promising recruit, and something about that plain, unremarkable respect settled more comfortably with Alara than any amount of concern could have. "You favor your left side when you tire," he told her on the second morning, watching her run through a sequence of strikes against the old training post. "Draven will notice that within the first minute, if you let exhaustion show even slightly." "Then I will not let it show," Alara said, adjusting her stance. "Everyone tires eventually," Edmund said. "The trick is not hiding it. The trick is making your opponent believe you have more left than you actually do, right up until the moment it no longer matters." Alara considered this, then nodded slowly, filing it away, alongside a lifetime of similar lessons learned the hard way, along a border that had never allowed for gentle teaching. Ravik, for his part, spent those 3 days differently than he had spent any 3 days of his reign before. He met with his council not to discuss whether the duel should proceed, but to ensure that it proceeded with every formal protection Ashen tradition allowed. He reviewed the exact terms Draven had agreed to: first blood or surrender, no killing strikes permitted under formal challenge law, penalties severe enough that even a king as arrogant as Draven Kale would hesitate before breaking them openly in front of witnesses from both courts. He also, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, began spending his evenings with Alara, not as a king managing a political asset, but as a husband beginning, finally, to know his own wife. They spoke of small things at first: her father's lands, the books she preferred, the strange, specific compound words her old training master used to describe certain fighting stances, words that existed nowhere else, invented out of necessity to describe movements no polite vocabulary had ever needed before. He used to call it the crooked strike, she told Ravik on the second evening, demonstrating a small motion with her hand, because the angle looks wrong to anyone watching, wrong enough that opponents hesitate half a second, trying to understand what they are seeing. That half second is usually all the opening you need. "That sounds more like a trick than a technique," Ravik said, almost smiling. "Every technique is a trick, if it works," Alara said. "The wrongness is the point. An opponent expecting a proper, correct strike is not prepared for something that breaks the pattern entirely." Ravik found himself, against every expectation he had carried into this marriage, genuinely enjoying these quiet evenings, learning a woman he had spent 3 months assuming he already understood completely, only to discover how little of her he had actually seen. He found himself noticing small things now that he had overlooked before: the careful way she assessed every room she entered, the calluses along her palms she no longer bothered hiding from him, the quiet, steady confidence beneath her calm exterior that had nothing to do with arrogance, and everything to do with simply knowing, without doubt, exactly what she was capable of. On the third evening, the night before the new moon, Ravik found her in her chambers sharpening the same worn blade he had once glimpsed briefly, months earlier, before understanding what it meant. She worked the whetstone along the edge with slow, practiced strokes, her focus absolute, her breathing even. "Tomorrow night," Ravik said, sitting across from her. "Tomorrow night," she agreed, not looking up from the blade. "Are you afraid?" he asked. Alara paused, considering the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "I would be foolish not to feel something before a fight like this," she said. "But fear and readiness are not the same thing. I have felt fear before every serious fight I have ever survived. It has never once stopped me from finishing what needed finishing. I believe you, Ravik said, and this time, the words came easily, without hesitation, without the doubt that had colored every assumption he had made about her since her arrival. She looked up at him then, something unguarded passing briefly across her expression, before the familiar calm settled back into place. Whatever happens tomorrow night, she said, I need you to trust what you see, rather than what you expected to see. Can you do that? Yes, Ravik said, I can do that. She returned to sharpening the blade, and Ravik sat with her in comfortable silence as the candle burned lower, watching the steady, practiced motion of her hands, understanding now, fully and completely, that the woman across from him was nothing like the fragile bride he had once dismissed at the top of his own palace stairs, and everything like the wall Draven Kale was about to discover he could not push through. The morning of the new moon arrived gray and still, the kind of quiet that settles over a place before something irreversible is about to happen. The palace woke early, servants moving through the halls with unusual care, voices hushed, as though loud words might somehow disturb the balance of the day ahead. In the Blackfang camp, set up in tents along the eastern edge of the palace grounds, Draven Kale woke in an unusually good mood, laughing over breakfast with his advisors about the evening to come. A human woman, he said, shaking his head as he ate. I confess I did not expect my visit here to end with such entertainment. Perhaps I should thank Ravik for the amusement, whatever else this treaty has cost me. You should not underestimate her, my king, one of his advisors said carefully. The rumors from the Ashen Court say she trains daily, alone, before dawn. Say she disarmed an assassin without difficulty. Say the Beta Edmund Hale himself has taken an interest in her training. Draven waved this off with the easy confidence of a man who had never once lost a fight he considered beneath him. Rumors grow larger with every telling, he said. I have fought real soldiers, trained from birth for war, wolves twice her size and stronger by nature than any human could ever hope to become. Whatever she has learned playing at combat in a forgotten courtyard, it will not matter once she stands across from someone who has actually killed to survive. He said this with such casual certainty that none of his advisors pressed the matter further, though the uneasy advisor kept his doubts quietly to himself, watching his king finish breakfast with the growing, private sense that Draven's confidence might prove to be his greatest weakness before the night was through. Across the palace grounds, Elara spent the day in careful, deliberate calm. She ate a light meal at midday, rested through the afternoon, and spoke to almost no one beyond brief, necessary exchanges with the servants preparing the dueling grounds. Edmund visited her once, briefly, offering no new advice, simply standing with her in comfortable silence for several long minutes before speaking. You are ready, he said finally. It was not a question. I have been ready for a long time, Elara said. Longer than anyone in this palace realizes. For what it is worth, Edmund said. I no longer doubt that. Whatever happens tonight, I wanted you to know that. Thank you, Edmund, she said, and meant it. Ravik came to her chambers as the afternoon light began to fade, finding her already dressed for the duel in simple, practical clothing that bore no resemblance to the elaborate gowns the court had grown used to seeing her wear. Her hair was pulled back tightly. The worn blade she had carried since she was 16 years old sat sheathed at her side, alongside a second, shorter blade Edmund had quietly provided that morning, standard practice for formal duels under Ashen tradition. How do you feel? Ravik asked. Steady, she said, and it was the truth. Whatever fear had visited her in quiet moments over the past 3 days had settled now into something calm and focused, the particular stillness she had learned long ago to summon in the hours before a fight that mattered. I have arranged for healers to be present at the grounds, Ravik said, regardless of the outcome. That is wise, Elara said, though I do not intend to need them. Ravik studied her for a long moment, memorizing something in her expression he could not quite name, gratitude perhaps, or something closer to the beginning of real affection, built not on the arrangement that had brought them together, but on 3 days of finally, truly seeing the woman standing in front of him. Whatever happens tonight, he said, I want you to know that I no longer see you as the woman who climbed my palace stairs 3 months ago. I see you as exactly what you are. I should have seen it from the beginning, and I am sorry that I did not. You see me now, Elara said. That is what matters. The horn sounded across the palace grounds, calling both courts to the dueling field, and Elara rose, drawing a slow, even breath, settling into the particular quiet focus that had carried her through every serious fight of her life. Way. It is time, she said. Ravik walked with her as far as the edge of the dueling field, where tradition required combatants to enter alone, and stopped there, watching her walk the remaining distance toward the center of the field where Draven Kale already waited, relaxed and smiling, utterly confident in an outcome he had already decided in his own mind long before the fight began. The gathered crowd fell silent as the last light faded from the sky, the new moon offering no illumination beyond the ring of torches set around the dueling field, casting long, uncertain shadows across the packed earth, where two very different understandings of the same woman were about to collide. Draven Kale rolled his shoulders and drew his blade with an easy, practiced motion, grinning across the torchlit field at the small figure walking toward him. "Last chance to surrender, with your dignity intact," he called out, loud enough for both watching crowds to hear. "No one will think less of you for yielding before this begins." "I appreciate the concern," Alara said, drawing her own blade, "though I suspect it is misplaced." The formal announcer called the terms of the duel, first blood or surrender, no killing strikes permitted, and stepped back from the field. For one long suspended moment, neither combatant moved, the torches crackling, the crowd holding its breath. Draven struck first, a fast, testing blow meant to gauge her speed rather than end things immediately, still treating this as an amusement rather than a genuine contest. Alara stepped aside with minimal motion, letting his blade pass a hand's width from where she had stood a heartbeat earlier, and did not counter, simply resetting her stance, watching him with calm, patient attention. "Quick," Draven admitted, circling. But quick is not enough. He came again, faster this time, a real strike aimed to end the duel in a single decisive motion, certain her speed alone could not possibly account for the difference in their reach and strength. Alara met the strike with her own blade, redirecting rather than blocking outright, letting his momentum carry his arm past her rather than absorbing the full force of the blow, and in the half-second his balance shifted. She drove her elbow into his ribs with controlled, precise force. Draven staggered back, surprised, the crowd's murmur rising audibly for the first time. "Lucky," he said, though something in his voice had shifted slightly. "You keep using that word," Alara said. "I would encourage you to consider that it might not apply here." He came at her harder now, abandoning the casual amusement of moments earlier, driving forward with real strength, real speed, the full weight of years spent as a warrior king behind every strike. Alara gave ground steadily, absorbing the pressure, watching, waiting, letting him spend his early aggression against a defense that bent without breaking, each of his strikes finding empty air or the flat of her blade rather than the mark he intended. The crooked strike, when it came, arrived exactly as her old training master had described it, an angle that looked wrong to anyone watching, wrong enough that Draven's instincts hesitated for the barest fraction of a second, trying to process a motion that broke every pattern he had trained his entire life to expect. That half-second was all she needed. Her blade caught his forearm in a shallow, controlled cut, drawing first blood cleanly. Immediately, the crowd erupting into stunned silence rather than cheers, no one entirely certain what they had just witnessed. Draven stared down at the thin line of blood along his arm, then up at Alara, disbelief written plainly across his face. "Impossible," he said. "Improbable, perhaps," Alara said, lowering her blade slowly, not lowering her guard. "Not impossible." The terms were first blood, King Draven. "I believe that concludes our duel." For a long, dangerous moment, Draven's expression twisted with something far more volatile than simple disbelief, his pride refusing to accept an outcome his mind had never allowed as possible. His hand tightened around his blade, and for one heartbeat, it seemed as though he might break the formal terms entirely, might strike again in violation of everything the duel represented. Then Ravik stepped forward from the edge of the field, his own presence a clear, silent warning, and Edmund moved with him, and the gathered Ashen guards shifted subtly into position, and Draven, whatever his pride demanded, was not foolish enough to ignore the reality of the moment. He lowered his blade slowly, jaw tight, humiliation burning visibly across his face in the torchlight. "First blood," he said finally, forcing the words out. "The duel is concluded." The crowd erupted then, a wave of sound breaking the tense silence that had held the field captive, disbelief giving way to astonishment giving way to something closer to awe. Alara stood at the center of it all, breathing steady, blade lowered, entirely unchanged by the roar around her, as though this outcome had never been in doubt, at least not to her. Draven sheathed his blade with stiff, controlled movements, refusing to meet anyone's eyes as he turned and walked back toward his own delegation, the humiliation of his defeat trailing behind him like a shadow he would not easily shake off. His earlier claim, that a king who could not protect his own bride's honor had no claim to real strength, now curdled into something far more damning, spoken as it had been in front of two full courts who had just watched that very bride defeat him personally, without assistance, without hesitation, without ever once needing anyone else to fight her battle for her. Ravik crossed the field to where Alara stood, the crowd parting easily around him, his expression a mixture of relief and something deeper, something that had been building quietly over the past 3 days, and had finally found its true shape in this single moment. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was prepared," Alara said, though something in her tone suggested she was allowing herself, finally, to feel the full weight of what she had just accomplished. "I misjudged you from the very first moment you walked through my gates," Ravik said. "I will spend a long time making up for that mistake, if you will allow me the chance." Alara looked at him for a long moment, the torchlight catching something new in her expression, something that had not been there 3 months earlier, when she had first climbed his palace stairs expecting nothing more than a cold, arranged duty. "I will allow you the chance," she said, "though I expect you to earn it properly this time." "I intend to," Ravik said, and for the first time since this marriage had begun, he meant every word of it completely. The Black Fang delegation departed the following morning, earlier than originally planned, Draven Kale offering only the barest formal courtesies before riding out through the palace gates without a backward glance. Word of the duel had already begun spreading beyond the palace walls, carried by traders and travelers who had witnessed it firsthand, growing slightly larger and more remarkable with every retelling, though the truth needed little exaggeration to remain extraordinary on its own. Within the Ashen Court, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. The nobles who had once whispered about the fragile, ornamental human bride now watched Alara with open respect, some with outright admiration, a few, inevitably, with the quiet resentment of people who had badly misjudged someone and did not enjoy being reminded of it. She accepted all of it with the same calm composure she had carried since her arrival, neither seeking the sudden attention nor shrinking from it, simply continuing to be exactly who she had always been. The kitchen staff who had once forgotten her meals now brought them promptly and without complaint. The seamstress who had once delivered a deliberately poor gown now sought Alara out personally, offering, with visible embarrassment, to make amends through better work going forward. Alara accepted these small corrections graciously, without holding grudges, understanding that fear and respect often traveled the same road, arriving at the same destination through different means. Ravik called a formal council meeting 3 days after the duel, and for the first time since her arrival, Alara was invited to sit at the table not as a treaty obligation being observed politely from a distance, but as a voice the king expected to hear from directly. "The Black Fang threat has not disappeared," Edmund said, addressing the gathered council. "Draven's pride will not allow this humiliation to stand unanswered forever. We should assume he will look for other ways to test our borders in the coming months." "Agreed," Ravik said, "which is precisely why I intend to strengthen our eastern defenses, and why I would value input from someone who has studied border warfare far more closely than most of this council." He looked directly at Alara as he said it, and several of the older advisors exchanged glances, unused to a human bride being addressed as a genuine strategic voice rather than a diplomatic afterthought. "My father's household guard developed several defensive formations specifically suited to fighting along contested borders," Alara said, without hesitation. "I would be glad to share what I know, if the council finds it useful." "We would," Ravik said, and the matter was settled without further debate, a small but significant shift in how this palace now understood the woman who had arrived 3 months earlier, expecting nothing more than a cold, arranged duty. That evening, Ravik found Alara in the northern courtyard again, though this time she was not training alone. Edmund stood with her, along with 2 younger guards who had asked, with visible nervousness, whether she might be willing to teach them some of what she knew. She agreed readily, correcting their stances with the same patient, practical attention Edmund had once shown her, building something new in that forgotten corner of the palace grounds, something that would grow, in the months ahead, into a proper training program respected across the entire kingdom. Ravik watched from the edge of the courtyard for a while before she noticed him, and when she did, she offered him something he had not seen from her before, a small, genuine smile, unguarded, entirely unlike the careful composure she showed the rest of the court. "You are building quite a reputation," he said, once the guards had gone and they were alone in the fading evening light. "I am simply doing what I have always done," Alara said. "The difference now is that people are finally willing to look." "I owe you an apology that goes beyond words," Ravik said. 3 months of assumptions I never bothered questioning. I do not know how to properly make up for that." "You already have," Alara said. "You saw me, Ravik, truly saw me, when it mattered most. That is worth more than any apology you could offer now." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, something settling quietly into place between them that had not existed 3 months earlier. Something built, not on an arranged treaty or a political necessity, but on the slow, difficult work of finally understanding each other properly. I thought I was marrying a fragile human bride who would need protecting, Ravik said. I did not realize I was marrying someone who would end up protecting this entire kingdom, and teaching me something about my own blindness in the process. We protect each other, Alara said. That is what a real alliance looks like, Ravik. Not one person shielding another, but two people standing together, each aware of exactly what the other brings to the fight. Above them, the moon had begun its slow return from darkness, a thin crescent rising over the palace walls, marking the passage of time since the night everything had changed. The Ashen Kingdom stood stronger now than it had in years, not because a rival king had been humiliated in a formal duel, but because its own king had finally learned to see clearly, to recognize strength where he had once assumed only weakness, and to build something real with the woman he had once dismissed as nothing more than a quiet, ornamental treaty. Ilara Voss, once written off as fragile by an entire court that judged her on sight, had proven, in the space of a single night beneath a darkened moon, exactly what she had always known about herself. Strength did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waited patiently, training alone before dawn in a forgotten courtyard, until the moment finally came to show the world what had been there all along.